Kate Morrison walked through the empty corridors of the human embassy for the last time. Her footsteps echoed against the metal walls as she carried a single briefcase. Behind her, the last boxes of human belongings were being loaded onto transport. Ships. In 3 hours, every human in the galaxy would be gone. The Galactic Council chamber had been unusually quiet that morning when Kate delivered her final message. She had stood at the podium, looking out at the representatives of 47 different species. The Xanthari delegates sat in their high chairs, their blue skin glowing softly under the chamber lights. The insect-like klaxon buzzed quietly among themselves. The crystal beings of the Resonance Collective hummed with soft musical tones. The Human Federation is withdrawing from galactic affairs indefinitely, Kate had said. Her voice was calm and steady. We thank the Council for the opportunity to participate in galactic civilization. Our departure will begin immediately. That was all she said. No explanation, no dramatic speech, no threats or demands. Just those simple words, and then she had walked out. The council chamber erupted in confused chatter behind her, but Kate did not look back. Now, 3 months later, the galaxy was learning what it meant to live without humans. Chairman Veltar of the Xanthari Empire adjusted his ceremonial robes as he reviewed the weekly reports. His species had ruled their corner of the galaxy for over 1,000 years. They were proud, ancient, and believed deeply in order and tradition. The sudden departure of the humans had been, in his opinion, a minor inconvenience at best. Surely, you are not concerned about this human situation, his aide, Sub-Commander Nexhai, said as he placed a stack of data tablets on the chairman's desk. They were never truly important to galactic affairs. Veltar nodded slowly. The humans had only been part of the Galactic Council for 80 years. Before that, they had been isolated on their small blue planet, fighting wars among themselves and barely capable of space travel. Even after joining the Council, they had remained one of the smaller powers. Their military was modest, their territory limited to perhaps 30 star systems. Indeed, Veltar replied. The humans were always too emotional, too unpredictable. Perhaps it is better that they have removed themselves from civilized society. But even as he spoke these words, Veltar felt a small doubt growing in his mind. The reports on his desk told a different story than the one he wanted to believe. In the Outer Rim territories, pirate attacks had increased by 300%. Ships that had traveled safely for decades were now being raided regularly. Trade routes that had been secure were becoming dangerous. The Galactic Patrol was scrambling to respond, but they seemed unable to be everywhere at once. What Veltar did not know was that Captain Alex Rodriguez had been quietly coordinating anti-pirate operations in 7 different sectors. Alex and his small fleet of human ships had developed a reputation among criminals as ghosts, who appeared without warning and disappeared just as quickly. The pirates had learned to avoid certain routes, not because of official patrols, but because they feared the humans. Now Alex was gone, along with his ships and his crew. The pirates were testing their luck again, and they were finding the galaxy much less dangerous than before. Dr. Helen Carter packed the last of her research equipment into storage containers. The Galactic Research Institute had been her home for 15 years. She had worked alongside scientists from dozens of species, sharing knowledge and making discoveries that benefited everyone. Her colleagues had thrown her a small farewell party the week before. They had seemed confused by her decision to leave. Director Quantel, a tall gray being from the Whisper Worlds, had offered her a promotion and a raise if she would stay. Your work on quantum mechanics is revolutionary, he had told her. The Institute needs minds like yours. Helen had smiled politely and declined. What she did not tell him was that 3 of the Institute's most important research projects would collapse within months of her departure. not because she was irreplaceable, but because her human way of thinking had been the key to solving problems that other species approached differently. The Xanthari were excellent at following established procedures. The Klaxon were masters of efficient organization. The Resonance Collective could process vast amounts of data with perfect logic. But when a project required thinking outside established patterns, when it needed someone to ask, what if we tried something completely different? The humans had quietly filled that role. Helen's research on faster-than-light communication had seemed like basic theoretical work to her colleagues. They did not realize that her insights were the foundation for improvements to the entire Galactic Communication Network. Without her ongoing research, the network would slowly degrade and eventually fail. Commander Lisa Brooks stood on the bridge of the UNC Carolina, watching as her fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. Around her, 37 other human ships were making final preparations for departure. This was the last human military presence in Council space. Lisa had spent 20 years serving in the Joint Galactic Defense Forces. She had fought alongside Xanthari warriors, Klaxon battle swarms, and resonance energy beings. She had earned their respect through countless battles and had been promoted to Joint Commander of the Eastern Defense Grid. What her alien colleagues did not understand was that Lisa's tactical approach had been quietly revolutionizing galactic military doctrine. While other species relied on overwhelming force or perfect coordination, Lisa taught her mixed species units to be flexible and adaptive. She encouraged initiative among lower-ranking officers and developed strategies that could change rapidly. As battles developed, the Void Wraiths had been testing the galaxy's defenses for years, probing for weaknesses. Lisa's forces had consistently outmaneuvered them, not through superior firepower, but through unpredictable tactics that kept the enemy guessing. Her human instinct for improvisation, combined with the strengths of other species, had created a defense network that was stronger than the sum of its parts. Now Lisa was taking her knowledge with her, along with every human officer and soldier who had learned her methods. The defense grid would continue to function, but it would be rigid and predictable. The Void Wraiths would adapt quickly. Jake Foster finished his last diplomatic meeting in a conference room on the neutral station, Harmony Point. Across the table sat representatives from the Stellar Mining Consortium and the Free Traders Alliance, two groups that had been in conflict for over a decade. I believe we have reached an acceptable compromise, Jake said, sliding a datapad across the table. The mining rights will be shared, with profits split according to the formula we discussed. Both sides nodded and signed the agreement. They thanked Jake for his mediation and left the room satisfied. What they did not realize was that Jake had spent 6 months carefully building trust between the two groups, finding common ground where others saw only conflict, and crafting solutions that addressed everyone's core concerns without anyone feeling like they had lost. This was the 43rd major dispute that Jake had resolved in his 15 years as a diplomatic mediator. His success rate was remarkable, but few people in the galaxy knew his name. He worked quietly, behind the scenes, preventing conflicts before they could escalate into wars. The Galactic Council had official diplomats and peace negotiators, but they typically became involved only after situations had already become crisis. Jake and other human mediators like him had been working at the community level, solving problems while they were still small and manageable. With the humans gone, dozens of simmering disputes that had been quietly managed were about to boil over into open conflicts. The galaxy was about to become a much more violent place, and nobody yet understood why. 6 months had passed since the humans disappeared from galactic space. At first, most species barely noticed their absence. The galaxy was vast, with millions of inhabited worlds and thousands of different civilizations. What difference could one small species make? The answer came slowly, like cracks spreading through a dam. Captain Zexcall of the Xanthari Imperial Navy stood on his ship's bridge, staring at the tactical display. 3 merchant vessels had been destroyed in this sector. In the past week, pirates were growing bolder, hitting targets that should have been protected by patrol routes. "Where are our security ships?" Zexcall demanded of his communications officer. "Patrol Fleet 7 is responding to attacks in the Kalar system," came the reply. "Patrol Fleet 12 is dealing with raiders near the gas giant colonies. All other fleets are already engaged." Zexcall felt frustration building in his chest. The Xanthari Navy was spread too thin. They had ships, they had trained crews, but somehow they could not be everywhere they needed to be. Pirates struck in one sector, while the Navy responded to trouble in another. By the time the patrol ships arrived, the criminals were gone. What Zexcall did not know was that Captain Alex Rodriguez had been coordinating with pirates in a completely different way. Alex had not chased pirates from system to system. Instead, he had studied their patterns and positioned his ships where the pirates would be, not where they had been. He had shared information between sectors and created a network of ships that could respond to threats before they became disasters. The human approach had been less formal than the Xanthari military structure, but far more effective. Now that network was gone, and the galaxy's criminals were learning that they could operate with much less fear. On the mining world of Kepler 7, the situation was becoming desperate. Foreman Hickstar, a sturdy member of the rock-dwelling granite folk, watched as his mining operations ground to a halt. The exotic crystals his workers extracted were essential for faster-than-light engines, but the mines were located in asteroid fields that moved through dangerous space. "We cannot continue operations without escort ships," Hickstar told the planetary governor through a secure communication link. "The radiation storms in this sector are too unpredictable. Our workers are at risk." The governor, a klaxon with clicking mandibles and compound eyes, buzzed with agitation. "The Galactic Mining Authority says no escort ships are available. All military vessels are dealing with pirate attacks." Hickstar knew this was only part of the problem. The real issue was that human mining crews had been working in the most dangerous areas of the galaxy. While other species avoided regions with radiation storms, gravity anomalies, and hostile environments, humans seemed to thrive in exactly those conditions. Captain Derek Stone had led human mining expeditions into areas that other species considered impossible to work. His crews had extracted rare minerals from the hearts of stellar storms and had established operations in asteroid fields that shifted and changed daily. They had taken risks that made other species nervous, but their success rate had been remarkable. Derek had not just been brave. He had been smart about danger, learning to read the patterns of cosmic storms and understanding how to work safely in environments that killed other species. His operations had supplied 30% of the galaxy's rare minerals, though few. People realized how much they depended on his work. Now those minerals were becoming scarce. Prices were rising rapidly as supply lines failed. Entire industries that depended on exotic materials were beginning to shut down. Dr. Monica Price had been the chief engineer for the Galactic Communication Network. Her small office on the orbital station above Terra Nova had been filled with monitoring equipment that tracked data flow across hundreds of star systems. When she left, her colleagues assumed the network would continue running smoothly without her. They were wrong. The quantum communication array that connected the galaxy was incredibly complex. It required constant adjustment and maintenance to account for stellar drift, gravitational changes, and cosmic interference. Monica had developed a system of predictive maintenance that prevented problems before they occurred. Her replacement, Dr. Velgon of the Crystal Collective, was highly skilled and understood the technology perfectly. But Dr. Velgon, approached problems differently than Monica had. Where Monica had made intuitive leaps and creative solutions, Dr. Velgon followed established procedures and logical analysis. The first communication blackouts lasted only a few minutes. Ships lost contact with their home bases briefly before. Connections were restored. Dr. Velgon traced each failure to its source and made repairs according to standard protocols, but the blackouts kept happening. What Dr. Velgon did not understand was that Monica had been making hundreds of small adjustments to prevent cascading failures. She had seen patterns in the data that indicated where problems would develop weeks or months in advance. Her preventive work had been invisible to her colleagues because she had fixed problems before they became noticeable. Now those problems were surfacing all at once. Communication delays were growing longer. Some remote systems were losing contact for hours at a time. The network that held galactic civilization together was slowly falling apart. Commander Veltar reviewed the military reports with growing concern. His son, Captain Zexkal, had submitted another request for additional patrol ships. Similar requests were coming from every sector commander in Xanthari space. But the real problem was not a lack of ships. The problem was strategy. The Void Wraiths had been quiet for decades, contained at the galaxy's edge by a carefully coordinated defense network. Now they were testing the boundaries again, sending small raids into civilized space to probe for weaknesses. Commander Lisa Brooks had been in charge of the Eastern Defense Grid, the section of space where most Void Wraith incursions occurred. Her mixed-species crews had developed tactics that consistently outmaneuvered the Wraiths, keeping them contained while minimizing losses. Lisa's approach had been completely different from traditional galactic military doctrine. Instead of massive battles and overwhelming force, she had used small, flexible units that could adapt quickly to changing situations. Her human crews had taught alien officers to think creatively and take initiative when standard procedures were not working. The Void Wraiths fought in ways that confused other species. They used tactics that seemed random and chaotic, striking without warning and disappearing before reinforcements could arrive. Traditional military minds tried to predict their movements using logic and analysis, but the Wraiths did not follow logical patterns. Humans, however, seemed to understand chaos. They fought unpredictably themselves, using strategies that kept the enemy guessing. Lisa's forces had been just as chaotic as the Wraiths, but in a controlled way that achieved specific objectives. Now, the defense grid was being reorganized under traditional command structures. The new commanders were competent and experienced, but they relied on established tactics and predictable responses. The Void Wraiths were already adapting to this change, and their raids were becoming more successful. On the diplomatic front, the situation was deteriorating even faster. Ambassador Jake Foster had been mediating a dispute between the Stellar Mining Consortium and the Free Traders Alliance for several months before his departure. The agreement he had negotiated was holding, but barely. The problem was that Jake had not just solved the immediate conflict. He had been building relationships and trust between the two groups that would prevent future disputes. His patient work had been creating a foundation for long-term cooperation. Without that ongoing relationship building, old suspicions were returning. Small disagreements that Jake would have resolved quickly were escalating into larger conflicts. Within months, the mining consortium and the traders were back to viewing each other as enemies rather than partners. Similar patterns were emerging across the galaxy. Dozens of carefully negotiated agreements were breaking down. Trade disputes were becoming political conflicts. Border disagreements were escalating toward military confrontations. The galactic peace that everyone had taken for granted was revealed to be much more fragile than anyone had realized. It had depended on quiet work by human mediators who had prevented small problems from becoming large wars. Chairman Veltar sat in his office, reviewing reports that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Pirate attacks were up, resource shortages were spreading, communication failures were becoming common, military threats were growing, but surely these were just temporary problems. The galaxy had survived for millions of years before humans had, even developed space travel. How important could one small species really be? The answer to that question was becoming clearer every day, but Veltar was not yet ready to accept what the evidence was telling him. 1 year had passed since the humans vanished from known space. The problems that had started as small cracks were now breaking apart the foundation of galactic civilization. Chairman Veltar could no longer ignore what was happening around him. Centauri Empire, which had ruled its territories for over 1,000 years, was facing challenges it had never encountered before. Trade routes were collapsing. Communication networks were failing. Military defenses were crumbling. And worst of all, nobody could figure out how to stop the decline. "We must find the humans," Veltar announced during an emergency session of the Galactic Council. His blue skin had lost some of its natural glow, and his ceremonial robes seemed to hang loosely on his frame. The stress of the past year had aged him considerably. The council chamber was only half full. Several species had already withdrawn. Their representatives, focusing their resources on protecting their own territories rather than participating in galactic government. The empty seats served as a stark reminder of how quickly things were falling apart. "With respect, Chairman," buzzed Hive Queen Zektra of the Klaxon, her compound eyes reflecting the chamber lights. "Finding the humans may be impossible. Our scouts have searched every system within 500 light-years of their former territories. They have found nothing." This was true. The search for humanity had become the largest exploration effort in galactic history. Hundreds of ships from dozens of species had spent months combing through star systems, looking for any trace of where the humans might have gone. They had found abandoned colonies, empty space stations, and derelict ships, but no signs of living. Humans. What the searchers did not know was that the humans had been planning their departure for decades. While they had appeared to be integrating into galactic society, they had been secretly building a completely independent civilization far beyond the borders of known space. Dr. Peter Hayes had been the head of xenobiology research at the Galactic Medical Center. His specialty was treating diseases that affected multiple species, particularly the strange illnesses that sometimes emerged when different alien biologies interacted with each other. 3 months after Peter left with the other humans, the first cases of crystalline plague appeared among the Resonance Collective. This disease had been contained for over 2 centuries, appearing only rarely and always being quickly treated by medical teams who understood its complex nature. The plague attacked the energy patterns that formed the consciousness of crystal beings. Infected individuals would lose coherence, their thoughts becoming scattered and chaotic before their physical forms eventually dissolved into inert mineral fragments. Dr. Silken, Peter's replacement at the medical center, was an expert in energy-based life forms. He understood the theoretical basis for treating crystalline plague, but when he tried to apply the standard treatments, they did not work out. The problem was that Peter had been continuously refining the treatment protocols based on new research and changing conditions. The plague organism evolved constantly, requiring doctors to adapt their approach with each outbreak. Peter had developed an intuitive understanding of how the disease changed and had been updating treatment methods faster than the official medical databases could record. Without Peter's ongoing research, the medical teams were using outdated treatments on a disease that had evolved beyond their understanding. The plague began spreading through Resonance Collective worlds at an alarming rate. Entire communities of crystal beings were dissolving into lifeless rock formations. The Resonance Collective, known for their logical approach to problems, found themselves unable to find a rational solution. Their most brilliant minds worked frantically to develop new treatments, but they could not match the intuitive leaps that Peter had made in his research. Captain Nicole Stone had commanded a small fleet of human escort ships that provided security for refugee convoys. Her work had been largely invisible to the galactic government because she had operated in neutral zones and frontier regions where official authority was limited. Nicole had specialized in protecting the most vulnerable populations in the galaxy. When wars broke out, when natural disasters struck, or when entire populations needed to be relocated, Nicole and her crews had been there to ensure safe passage through dangerous space. Her ships had been faster and more maneuverable than traditional military vessels, designed for speed and stealth rather than heavy combat. Nicole had developed tactics for moving large numbers of civilian ships through hostile territory without being detected by pirates or enemy forces. The Xanthari military had escort capabilities, but they were designed for protecting military convoys and high-value cargo. The Klaxon had efficient transport systems, but they worked only within their own territory. Other species had their own solutions, but none of them had developed Nicole's expertise in protecting refugees and displaced populations. Now, with conflicts breaking out across the galaxy, millions of civilians were trapped in war zones with no way to reach safety. Refugee camps were overflowing. Transport ships were being attacked by pirates who knew that no one was protecting them. The humanitarian crisis was growing worse every day. Engineer Monica Price had left behind detailed technical manuals and training materials when she departed from the Galactic Communication Network. Her replacement, Dr. Velgon, had studied these materials carefully and had trained his staff in Monica's maintenance procedures. But the communication network was still failing. The problem was not that. Dr. Velgon did not understand the technology. The problem was that Monica had been making constant improvements and adjustments that she had never documented. Her approach to engineering had been to try new solutions, test different configurations, and gradually optimize the system through continuous experimentation. Dr. Velgon's approach was more methodical. He followed established procedures and made changes only after careful analysis and approval from his supervisors. This was a perfectly reasonable way to manage a complex system, but it was not how Monica had been working. Monica had been treating the communication network like a living organism that needed constant care and feeding. She had made thousands of small improvements over the years, each one building on the previous changes to create a system that was far more efficient and reliable than its original design. Without Monica's continuous improvements, the network was slowly reverting to its original configuration. Components that had been optimized for specific conditions were now operating under different parameters. Systems that had been fine-tuned to work together were losing synchronization. The communication delays that had started as minor inconveniences were now affecting trade, military coordination, and emergency services. Some star systems were losing contact with the galactic network for days at a time. The fabric that held interstellar civilization together was unraveling. Admiral Coxtel of the Xanthari Imperial Fleet stood in the war room, looking at a three-dimensional display of the galaxy. Red markers indicated void wraith incursions, and there were far too many of them. The void wraiths had been testing the galaxy's defenses for months, sending small raiding parties to probe weaknesses. What they had found was a defense network that was strong in theory, but inflexible in practice. The Eastern Defense Grid, once commanded by Lisa Brooks, had been reorganized under traditional Xanthari military doctrine. The new commanders were experienced officers who understood conventional warfare, but they were struggling to adapt to the Void Wraith's chaotic fighting style. Lisa had trained her crews to think like the enemy, to embrace chaos and unpredictability as tactical advantages. Her mixed-species units had learned to fight in ways that confused both themselves and their opponents. creating a kind of controlled madness that the Void Wraiths could not predict or counter. The new defense commanders tried to apply logical analysis to Void Wraith tactics, looking for patterns and weaknesses they could exploit. But the Wraiths did not follow patterns. They fought with a kind of alien intelligence that defied rational understanding. Without Lisa's unconventional approach, the defense grid was losing ground steadily. Void Wraith raids were penetrating deeper into civilized space, and the attacks were becoming more coordinated and destructive. Back on the Zenthari homeworld, Chairman Veltar received a report that made his blood run cold. Intelligence analysts had discovered evidence that the humans had not simply disappeared. They had been preparing for their departure for decades, building secret facilities and stockpiling resources far beyond the reach of galactic exploration. The report suggested that humanity had established contact with unknown species in unexplored regions of space. They had been developing new technologies and expanding their capabilities while appearing to be junior partners in galactic civilization. They were never the weak species we believed them to be, Veltar said to his aide, reading through the classified documents. They were gathering strength while we looked down on them. The evidence painted a picture of a species that had been far more capable and far-sighted than anyone had realized. While other civilizations had focused on maintaining their established territories and power structures, humans had been quietly building something entirely new. 2 years had passed since the humans vanished from galactic space. What had once been the greatest civilization in the galaxy was now breaking apart like a ship torn apart by cosmic storms. The Galactic Council met in emergency session, but there were only 12 representatives left in the chamber that had once held delegates from over 200 worlds. Chairman Veltar looked older than his 800 years. His once proud blue skin had faded to a dull gray, and his hands shook as he read the latest reports. Each document told the same story from a different angle. The galaxy was dying. The Klaxon Hive has lost contact with 47 of their colony worlds, announced Sub-Commander Nexhigh, his voice barely steady. Their supply chains have completely collapsed. Their rigid hierarchy cannot adapt to the constant emergencies. This was perhaps the most shocking development of all. The Klaxon had been masters of organization and efficiency for thousands of years. Their hive mind structure had allowed them to coordinate vast operations across multiple star systems with perfect precision. But that same rigid structure had become their weakness. Queen Zitra had tried to adapt to the changing conditions, but the Klaxon way of thinking did not allow for the kind of flexibility that the current crisis demanded. When their carefully planned supply routes failed, they could not quickly develop alternatives. When their standard procedures did not work, they could not improvise new solutions. The humans had often worked with Klaxon administrators, and Captain Alex Rodriguez had frequently coordinated security operations with their transport fleets. What the Klaxon had not realized was that Alex and other humans had been quietly filling the gaps in their system, providing the adaptability and creative problem-solving that their rigid structure lacked. Without human flexibility to balance their efficiency, the Klaxon Hive was suffocating under its own organizational weight. Entire colonies were being abandoned as the central administration failed to coordinate relief efforts. Dr. Velgon stood in the ruins of what had once been the galaxy's most advanced communication center. Sparks flew from damaged equipment as his technicians tried desperately to restore connections to the Outer Rim territories. They had lost contact with entire sectors of space. How long until we can re-establish the quantum link to the Andromeda sector? Dr. Veldon asked his chief engineer. Unknown, sir, came the reply. The cascade failure has affected the entire network backbone. We are trying to rebuild the system from scratch, but we do not have the original design specifications. This was the heart of the problem. Monica Price had made so many improvements to the communication network over the years that the current system bore little resemblance to its original design. She had never fully documented her changes because she had been constantly experimenting and refining her work. Dr. Velgon and his team were excellent engineers, but they were trying to repair a machine they did not fully understand. Every attempt to fix one problem created two new problems elsewhere in the network. The quantum communication array that had once connected thousands of worlds was now reduced to serving only a few dozen systems in the inner galaxy. Without reliable communication, trade agreements could not be negotiated. Military forces could not coordinate their movements. Scientific research could not be shared between institutions. The bonds that had held galactic civilization together were dissolving. On the medical research station orbiting Kepler Prime, the situation had moved beyond crisis into catastrophe. The crystalline plague had spread to 12 different worlds of the Resonance Collective, and the death toll was climbing into the millions. Dr. Silken had assembled the finest medical minds from across the galaxy, but they were fighting a losing battle against a disease that seemed to evolve faster than they could develop treatments. Each time they thought they had found a cure, the plague would mutate into a new form that resisted their efforts. The organism is adapting to our treatments faster than any natural evolution should allow, Dr. Silkan reported to the Emergency Medical Council. It is almost as if someone designed it to be resistant to conventional medicine. What Dr. Silkan did not understand was that Dr. Peter Hayes had been fighting the same evolutionary arms race for years. Peter had developed an instinctive understanding of how the plague organism changed and had learned to anticipate its adaptations. His treatment protocols had been constantly evolving to stay ahead of the disease. Peter had also been working on a completely new approach to treating the plague, based on understanding its fundamental nature rather than just attacking its symptoms. His research had been close to a breakthrough when he left with the other humans, but his notes were encrypted and his laboratory equipment had been removed. The Resonance Collective, beings of pure energy who prided themselves on logical thinking, were watching their civilization dissolve as the plague consumed their people. Their most rational minds could not solve a problem that required intuitive leaps and creative thinking. In the frontier regions, the humanitarian crisis had reached unimaginable proportions. Captain Nicole Stone's absence was felt most acutely. In the neutral zones, where millions of refugees were trapped without protection or hope of escape, the war between the Stellar Mining Consortium and the Free Traders Alliance had finally erupted into open conflict. The careful diplomatic work that Jake Foster had done to prevent this war had unraveled within months of his departure. Now both sides were using military force to settle disputes that had once been resolved through negotiation. The fighting had displaced entire populations from mining worlds and trading stations. Refugee convoys moved slowly through space, vulnerable to pirate attacks and military strikes from both sides of the conflict. Without Nicole's escort fleets to protect them, many convoys never reached their destinations. The few remaining galactic peacekeeping forces were overwhelmed. They had ships and weapons, but they lacked Nicole's expertise in moving large numbers of civilian vessels through hostile territory without being detected. Traditional military escorts were too slow and too visible, making them easy targets. For the increasingly bold pirates, refugee camps had become death traps as resources ran out and disease spread through overcrowded facilities. The Galactic Refugee Agency estimated that over 50 million people were currently displaced, with more joining their ranks every day as new conflicts erupted across civilized space. Admiral Coxtall reviewed the tactical reports with growing despair. The Void Wraiths had launched their largest offensive in 1,000 years, and the Galactic Defense Forces were crumbling before their advance. 17 star systems had already fallen to the Wraiths, their populations either killed or taken as slaves to unknown regions beyond the galactic rim. The defensive grid that had once contained the wraiths at the edge of space had been shattered by their coordinated assault. They are not fighting randomly anymore. Admiral Cox-Tall reported to the Emergency Defense Council. Their attacks are coordinated and strategic. They have learned to exploit our weaknesses. The truth was that the Void Wraiths had been studying galactic military tactics for decades, waiting for the right moment to strike. They had recognized that Lisa Brooks and her human-trained officers represented the greatest threat to their expansion plans. Lisa's unconventional tactics had kept the Wraiths confused and off balance. Her mixed-species crews had fought with a combination of chaos and purpose that the Wraiths could not predict or counter. But the new defense commanders followed traditional military doctrine, making their movements predictable and their strategies easy to counter. The Wraiths had adapted their own tactics to exploit the rigid thinking of conventional galactic military leaders. They struck where logic suggested they would not, retreated when victory seemed certain, and advanced when defeat appeared inevitable. Their apparent randomness was actually a carefully calculated strategy designed to confuse rational minds. Without Lisa's insight into controlled chaos, the defense forces were being systematically dismantled by an enemy that fought according to rules they could not understand. Chairman Veltar sat alone in his private chambers, reading reports that painted a picture of complete civilizational collapse. The Xanthari Empire, which had ruled for 1,000 years, was now reduced to protecting only its core worlds. Most of their colonies had been abandoned or lost to various threats. The Resonance Collective was dying from plague. The Klaxon Hive was paralyzed by its own inflexibility. The Depth Runners had retreated to their ocean worlds and severed all contact with the galactic community. Dozens of smaller civilizations had simply disappeared, their territories falling to pirates, plague, or the advancing Void Wraiths. A single message arrived through the failing communication network, transmitted on an old emergency frequency that had not been used in decades. The signal was weak and distorted, but the translation was clear enough. It was from Admiral Carol Martinez, speaking on behalf of something called the Human Colonial Alliance. To the former members of the Galactic Council, the message began, "We have monitored the situation in our former territories with great sadness. The collapse of galactic civilization was not our intention, but it was predictable given the fundamental flaws in the system we once served. 5 years had passed since the humans departed in silence. The great Galactic Council that had once governed thousands of worlds now existed only in memory. The magnificent chamber, where representatives from hundreds of species had debated the future of civilization, stood empty and dark. Its power systems long since failed. Chairman Veltar walked through the abandoned corridors of the council building one last time. His footsteps echoed in the silence, bouncing off walls that had once vibrated with the sounds of galactic democracy. He was alone now, the last keeper of a dead institution. Outside the windows, he could see the lights of the few remaining ships in orbit around the council world. Most were refugee vessels, carrying survivors from worlds that had fallen to plague, war, or simple collapse. The great fleets that had once protected galactic space were gone, scattered or destroyed in desperate attempts to hold back the tide of chaos. Veltar carried with him a small data device containing the final records of the Galactic Council. Tomorrow, he would join the last evacuation ship leaving the capital world. The Xanthari Empire, which had ruled for over 1,000 years, was abandoning its seat of power. In the Outer Rim territories, the situation had stabilized into a new kind of normal. Pirates ruled some sectors completely, establishing their own brutal kingdoms among the abandoned colonies. The Void Wraiths had claimed vast regions of space, enslaving entire populations and strip-mining worlds for resources they could use in their continued expansion. But in some areas, small groups of survivors had learned to work together in ways the old galactic civilization never had. Without the rigid hierarchies and species prejudices that had defined the Council era, desperate people were discovering that cooperation could accomplish what force and authority had failed to achieve. On the former mining world of Kepler-7, a mixed community of Xanthari, Klaxon, and Granite folk had established a successful settlement. They had learned to combine their different strengths, using Xanthari leadership, Klaxon organization, and Granite folk industrial skills to create something none of them could have built alone. Their leader was a young Xanthari engineer named Kexlai, who had spent years studying archived human engineering reports. She had learned to think differently about problems, approaching challenges with the kind of creative flexibility that humans had once brought to galactic civilization. "We cannot rebuild what we had before," Kexley told her mixed species council during their weekly planning meeting. "But we can build something better. The humans showed us that different ways of thinking can work together if we respect each other instead of trying to dominate each other." The settlement was small and isolated, but it was growing. Word had spread through the refugee networks that Kepler-7 offered something rare in the current galaxy: hope. People from dozens of different species were making the dangerous journey to join the community. Kexlai had been studying more than just human engineering techniques. She had been analyzing their approach to leadership, their methods of conflict resolution, and their ability to inspire others to work toward common goals. She was trying to understand what had made humans so effective at bringing out the best in other species. Dr. Velgon had finally abandoned the central communication station after years of trying to repair the quantum network. The task had proven impossible without the foundational knowledge that Monica Price had taken with her. But Dr. Velgon had not given up on communication entirely. Working with a small team of dedicated engineers, he had begun building a new kind of communication network. Instead of trying to recreate Monica's sophisticated quantum array, they were developing a simpler system that could be understood and maintained by anyone with basic technical training. The new network was slower and less efficient than what Monica had built, but it was also more robust and easier to repair. Dr. Velgon had learned that sometimes the best solution was not the most advanced one, but the one that could survive when things went wrong. The humans were right about one thing, Dr. Velgon told his team as they tested the first successful long-range transmission in 3 years. Technology should serve people, not the other way around. Our old system was so complex that only one person understood it completely. We will not make that mistake again. The new communication network was beginning to connect the scattered survivor communities across the galaxy. For the first time in years, isolated settlements were able to share information, coordinate aid efforts, and offer mutual support. Dr. Silkon had never found a cure for the crystalline plague. The disease had consumed most of the Resonance Collective before finally burning itself out when it ran out of new hosts to infect. But the tragedy had taught him valuable lessons about the importance of understanding different perspectives. Working with the few surviving members of his species, Dr. Silkon had established a new approach to medical research. Instead of relying on pure logic and analysis, they actively sought out different ways of thinking about problems. They recruited researchers from other species and encouraged unconventional ideas. Dr. Peter Hayes understood something we did not, Dr. Silkon explained to his new research team. Disease is not just a logical puzzle to be solved. It is a living challenge that requires intuition and creativity as much as scientific knowledge. We must learn to think like our patients, not just analyze their symptoms. The new medical center was smaller than the old Galactic Medical Institute, but it was already showing promising results. By combining logical analysis with intuitive insights, the research teams were developing treatments for diseases that had puzzled galactic medicine for centuries. In the former territories of the Klaxon Hive, The surviving colonies had been forced to abandon their rigid hierarchical structure. Without the central authority to coordinate their actions, individual communities had learned to make their own decisions and adapt to local conditions. The transition had been painful, and many Klaxon had died during the collapse of their civilization. But those who survived had discovered abilities they never knew they possessed. Without being told exactly what to do by their superiors, they had learned to think creatively and solve problems independently. Former hive worker Zekmon had become the leader of a small farming colony on the agricultural world of New Harmony. Her transformation from a mindless drone into an independent leader had taken years of painful adjustment, but she had eventually learned to value individual initiative over blind obedience. The humans tried to teach us that strength comes from diversity, not uniformity. Zekman told her council of former workers who had become community leaders. We thought they were weak because they argued among themselves. Now we understand that argument can lead to better solutions and silent agreement. Meanwhile, in the unexplored regions beyond the galactic rim, the human colonial alliance was thriving. Admiral Carl Martinez stood on the observation deck of the massive space station New Terra, watching construction ships build another orbital habitat around a distant star. The station was a marvel of engineering that combined human innovation with technologies learned from dozens of newly contacted alien species. Unlike the rigid structures of the old galactic civilization, New Terra was designed to grow and adapt as new communities joined the alliance. Status report on the integration of the spiral dancers. Admiral Martinez asked her aide, Commander Beth Rodriguez, daughter of the former captain Alex Rodriguez. Proceeding smoothly, Beth replied. Their approach to three-dimensional architecture is revolutionizing our habitat designs. In exchange, our defensive strategies are helping them protect their crystal gardens from the energy storms in their home system. The Human Colonial Alliance had grown to include over 200 different species, many of whom had never been contacted by the old Galactic Council. The Alliance operated on principles of mutual respect and voluntary cooperation that stood in stark contrast to the hierarchical dominance that had characterized the previous galactic civilization. Humans had become the unifying force that helped. Different species worked together, but they did not rule over the Alliance. Instead, they served as mediators, teachers, and facilitators, helping other species discover their own strengths and find ways to contribute to the common good. Back in the ruins of the old galaxy, Kexley received a transmission on her newly repaired communication equipment. The signal was faint and heavily encrypted, but it carried a message that would change everything for the scattered survivor communities. The message was from Dr. Elena Foster, daughter of the former diplomat Jake Foster. She was speaking on behalf of the Human Colonial Alliance humanitarian mission. To the survivors of the former galactic civilization, the message began. We have monitored your struggles with great sadness. While we cannot return to rebuild what was destroyed, we can offer assistance to those who wish to build something new. The message went on to explain that the Human Colonial Alliance was prepared to share medical knowledge to help fight diseases, communication technology to help reconnect isolated communities, and defensive strategies to help protect settlements from pirates and other threats.